work, taking a load off London's roads. Good evening. The British working week should be limited to 48 hours in line with the rest of the European Union. That's the overwhelming verdict of the European Parliament, which has voted to end Britain's opt-out of the Working Time Directive. The government says it will fight to keep things as they are, but Labour MEPs insist that Britain's longer working week raises concerns about health and safety. More from our economics editor, Evan Davis.
You can't miss the result. The European Parliament votes to toughen up the Working Time Directive. British Labour MEPs supported their socialist colleagues on the continent against the advice of the government back home.
We also need a proper work-life family balance in Britain. We've debated it long enough, now it's time to do something about it.
The existing directive says that workers should not exceed an average of 48 hours of work a week, but 3.5 million of us Brits do. MEPs voted today to scrap our right to opt out within 3 years. They also want time spent on call to be included in the counted hours. It's a big change if it occurs, but long hours are more and more a feature of posh white-collar jobs these days, and many of these are not covered. People who set their own hours are outside the directive. Tony Blair can still work long hours if he wants. There probably aren't enough people opting out and working over 48 hours a week, averaged over a whole year, for this measure to have a huge effect on the whole economy. But it could have a very large effect on parts of the economy. In the hospitality trade it might bite. That annoys the employers and also some workers. Fewer hours typically means less pay.
I would think maybe to take my freedom away from me. If I want to work, I work. If I don't want to work, I don't work. So I choose to work, choose the trade of catering. This is my trade. So I like to work more hours required for me to do.
On the other hand, this university lecturer used to have a job where long hours were the norm, and he says employees didn't choose that. There was subtle pressure.
Quite unseen, a culture can develop whereby people internalise the pressure to work longer and longer hours. No one's overtly coerced, but they do end up with unhealthy working practices.
If we remove the opt-out, does that give employees choices or remove them? It's an important debate. But the issue that opponents are focusing on is international competitiveness.
Europe is about competing with sustainable employment, being attractive to investors from around the world, and taking on China and India and Japan and Brazil and America. Instead of which, all these countries seem to be saying is, if there's one country over there in Europe with a competitive advantage, let's stop them.
It would be easy to think of Europe as a giant hand poking its finger into British affairs, but that would be to credit Europe with having a single coherent view of these matters. In fact, Europe's divided. Half of Brussels spends its day working out how to build a more socially just continent. The other half spends its day bemoaning the fact Europe isn't more flexible and competitive. It is not clear which side will ultimately prevail on this particular issue. Evan Davis, BBC News.
Let's talk to Bridget Kendall, our diplomatic correspondent, who's in Brussels tonight. Bridget, is it likely that the British government would be forced to accept this against its will?
Well, immediately no, and even in the long term there's a big question mark over it. The European Parliament can't just steamroll it through. According to the rules, this has to be a negotiated compromise between the Parliament, the Commission and the member countries. And Britain's taking heart from the fact that the new European Commission is making it pretty clear it doesn't want to see the opt-out go. And as far as member states go, Britain thinks that it's got support from some other countries, Germany, and particularly some countries from the new entrants into the EU who want to see their economies move fast and they don't want new regulations restricting their working practices. But even beyond that, I think Britain feels that it hopes that the economic argument, the one that was voiced in Evan's package there, that if you want to be competitive in the world, well, you can't have too restrictive practices, that in the long term this must be compelling. But this isn't just about logic. There's a very deep and agonised debate going on here in Europe. We're seeing it in the sort of things that are being voiced in the run-up to that French referendum on the constitution, in Germany over the pain of economic reforms, over whether the future is for a Europe that thinks about being competitive above all, or retaining a special Europe social model that cares about things like the work-life balance. And that debate's by no means over.
Bridget, in Brussels, thank you very much. The Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh have attended a memorial service at St Paul's Cathedral for the victims of the Boxing Day tsunami. Among the congregation were relatives and friends of those who died, as well as survivors and aid workers and representatives of the 12 countries principally affected. Nicholas Witchell reports now from St Paul's.
It was a disaster which reached into homes around the globe, which took the lives of more than 250,000. Close by the altar of St Paul's Cathedral sat the families of the 145 Britons who perished. Some have been denied even the comfort of a funeral. The remains of 21 victims are still missing.
We come to this cathedral to remember before God the people of so many nations who died in the tsunami disaster in the Indian Ocean, and in particular to hold in our prayers all from the United Kingdom who lost their lives.
The lesson was read by one of those for whom remembrance meant everything today, the film director Lord Attenborough, who lost his daughter Jane and granddaughter Lucy.
Death will be no more. Mourning and crying and pain will be no more. For the first things have passed away. Thanks be to God.
The Archbishop of Canterbury, Dr. Rowan Williams, led the act of remembrance.
God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear, though the earth be moved, and though the mountains tremble in the heart of the sea.
Candles were brought and placed on the altar, one for each of the 12 countries where the tsunami struck. And 12 of the British relatives came forward with the flowers of those countries, orchids and jasmine and hibiscus and water lily. And then, as silence was kept in the cathedral, from the whispering gallery under the dome, hundreds of thousands of rose petals fell, each petal symbolizing a lost life. The families heard the Archbishop speak of the pain of bereavement, but he spoke too of the enduring mystery of love in the hearts of the bereaved and in the world's response to the disaster. Afterwards, relatives said they'd felt strengthened.
It was incredibly comforting to be with so many people who had been through something so similar to us, and also just very, very moving.
The lost were remembered so that the living might move on. Nicholas Witchell, BBC News, at St Paul's Cathedral.
And later in the programme, we'll be hearing the stories of 2 Britons in Thailand and how their lives were changed by what happened. The Prime Minister has come face to face with some of his biggest critics in the Parliamentary Labour Party for the first time since the election. Despite some recent calls for him to step down, Mr Blair appealed for unity and loyalty and the space to engineer an orderly change of leadership in due course. Well, let's talk to Mark Mardell at Westminster. Mark, was it fireworks at this meeting?
Yeah, with a few rockets as well. Tony Blair started off by telling them they'd just won an election, but they could get a 4th election victory if only they stayed united. He said he'd been loyal to Labour after 3 election defeats. Why couldn't they be loyal after 3 election victories? And then about 5 MPs stood up to say, no, sorry, you're the problem. Out there during the election, you were the problem, you should go. They were booed and hissed. Now, after the meeting, one minister said, whingers routed. Another said that the silent majority has spoken. But I reckon a lot of the silent majority were clapping but keeping their thoughts to themselves.
And did Labour MPs get a better sense of Mr Blair's long-term plans?
Yes, I think probably the most important thing to come out of the meeting, that he asked them to give him space for an orderly transfer of power. Now, there are plenty of people there who think it's a complete nonsense to talk about challenging Tony Blair, ridiculous that he should be gone by the autumn, but they also think 4 years is a little too long, and they were quite pleased by that. They think it means that something will happen in a couple of years' time or so.
Mark, thanks very much. The bloodiest day in Iraq since the new government was formed just a fortnight ago saw over 70 people killed in a series of bomb attacks. A suicide bomber killed at least 32 people in Hawija, and they waited as in a crowded army recruitment centre. In Saddam's hometown of Tikrit, 33 people were killed in another suicide attack. And in the capital, Baghdad, 3 suicide bomb attacks and a number of shootings left at least 10 people dead, as Ben Brown now reports.
Saddam Hussein's behind bars, but today smoke was rising over his hometown of Tikrit. Iraq's insurgency is far from over. More than 30 people died here in a suicide attack. Across Iraq, this was a day of coordinated carnage. More wounded, more killed in a spate of bombings in Baghdad and at an army recruitment centre in the northern town of Hawija. Iraq's new Prime Minister had to comfort a boy whose father died in front of him. If you don't kill the man who did this to my father, he says, then I'll go out and kill him myself. No, says the Prime Minister Ibrahim Jafari, close to tears himself. I want you to help rebuild Iraq and to let justice take its course. Well, there were hopes the insurgency would peter out after millions of Iraqis voted in January's election. But if anything, it's now gathering fresh momentum. This seems to have been the trigger, the formation of Iraq's new government 2 weeks ago. Since then, 400 people have been killed, most of them civilians. America says insurgent attacks have doubled from 30 or 40 a day in February and March to 70 a day this month. Optimism is beginning to fade.
The upsurge of the suicide attacks in Iraq, which we are witnessing now, is indication that the insurgency would like to prove they have the upper hand, and they would like to prove this optimism was actually extremely wrong, was false optimism. So that's why they increased their attacks recently.
In Fallujah last year, the Americans hoped they'd all but destroyed the insurgency, but it is still going strong. So now US troops have launched their biggest operation since Fallujah in the western desert near the border with Syria. 1,000 US troops are taking on fighters loyal to Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, the most wanted terrorist in Iraq. For now, though, the bombings go on. Among today's victims, new recruits to the Iraqi army. Another blow to its morale and manpower. The Americans are desperate to hand over to Iraq's security forces, but at this rate it won't be anytime soon. Ben Brown, BBC News.
And still to come on tonight's programme. The stars are there, the movies are ready to run. It's the biggest film festival on earth.
It is, of course, Cannes, where today the first of 21 films kicked off the competition for the prestigious Palme d'Or.
The actor Macaulay Culkin has been giving evidence at the trial of Michael Jackson in California. The 24-year-old, who starred as a child in the Home Alone films, denied claims that Jackson had molested him when he'd visited the Neverland Ranch. Let's join David Willis, who's outside the court in Santa Maria.
Well, Hugh, for more than a decade, Macaulay Culkin has been the subject of rumours that he was sexually abused by Michael Jackson. The court has already heard that he was one of a number of young boys with whom the singer had what was called a special bond. Well, today, Macaulay Culkin came to court here to give his side of the story. He's the first Hollywood star to give evidence in this extraordinary trial. Now 24 years of age, Macaulay Culkin became friends with Michael Jackson when he was just 9 years old. It was this movie, Home Alone, which made Macaulay Culkin the most famous child star in the world. The court heard that shortly after it was released, he received a call out of the blue from Michael Jackson inviting him to Neverland. Whilst there, he said, the two bonded. Michael Jackson understood the pressures of being a child star. They started sharing the same bed. But asked by Michael Jackson's lawyer, Thomas Mesereau, did Mr. Jackson ever molest you? Macaulay Culkin replied, never. Did he improperly touch you? Absolutely not. Did he ever touch you in a sexual way? No. Asked about allegations from witnesses who said they'd seen him being kissed and fondled, Macaulay Culkin said, absolutely ridiculous.
Rob, can you tell us what made you decide to come today?
But under cross-examination by the prosecution, it was put to him that he could have been sexually abused while he was asleep. As far as I'm aware, he said, Michael Jackson never abused me.
Well, Macaulay Culkin is the third young man to appear in court to deny that he was sexually abused by Michael Jackson, and the first of what's expected to be a parade of celebrity witnesses, all coming here to testify on Michael Jackson's behalf. Hugh.
David, thank you very much. Police hunting the gang who killed 16-year-old Mary Ann Lenihan in Reading and seriously wounded her 18-year-old friend have made 2 more arrests. One man was detained in London, the other in Birmingham. Mary Ann was found stabbed in a park in Reading on Saturday. The international community has expressed deep concern at the latest news of North Korea's nuclear program. Thousands of fuel rods have been unloaded from a reactor which experts say would allow North Korea to make at least 2 atomic bombs. The Koreans insist that the process is purely for defensive purposes. James Robbins has more details.
In a world overshadowed by nuclear weapons, North Korea's ambitions pose the most unpredictable risk. It's true neighbouring Russia and China have vast arsenals, but in North Korea, an extraordinarily secretive Stalinist regime claims it has some weapons too and now intends to make more. Among its installations, focus now is on the Yongbyon complex. The regime says it has successfully finished removing 8,000 fuel rods from the reactor there in order to bolster its nuclear arsenal. North Korea kicked out international inspectors 3 years ago, so it's impossible to be sure what's going on. But experts are concerned.
Well, once you've removed the rod, you have to enter another process to extract the plutonium, and the plutonium becomes the heart of a nuclear weapon. This reactor will produce about 10, 12 kilograms, a little bit more perhaps, so that's enough to produce 2 nuclear weapons, about the same size as the Japanese Hiroshima bombs that were dropped by the Americans.
North Korea has all the trappings of military communism. No other country has so many of its citizens in uniform or so many believed to be in labour camps for dissidents. But this is only one reality. The other is mass poverty and an acute energy crisis, results of a failed economy. But pressure on North Korea to give up nuclear weapons isn't working. 6-party talks involving South Korea, Japan, as well as America, Russia and China have been boycotted by North Korea for almost a year. They accuse the US of planning an invasion. Washington denies that.
It's a bargaining chip, and it's clearly the case that they want to apply pressure, particularly on the US at the moment, to try and resurrect the agreements that they had with them to supply 500,000 tons of heavy oil to North Korea in exchange for assistance with a peaceful nuclear development program.
When I visited North Korea last year, mere rumours of a nuclear test explosion panicked neighbouring countries. There was no test then, but US spy satellites are said to be picking up signs of a possible test soon. Put that together with North Korea's latest commitment to increase its nuclear arsenal, and there's a new sense of urgency about efforts to persuade them to disarm.
James Robbins there. Many of those attending today's Tsunami Remembrance Service were aware that Thailand and its outlying islands saw the greatest loss of British lives. Thailand has not asked for any relief aid, but it has welcomed foreign volunteers to help in the aftermath, and many from Britain have answered that call. Andy Tando from Kent was on holiday when the tsunami struck. He spent several weeks working with the bereaved in Khao Lak. But first, we hear from Luke Simon. We were with him last December when he found the body of his brother Piers. Luke's been teaching in Chiang Mai, and we start with his story.
A wiser, more purposeful Luke Simon has returned to the classroom. But he still has sharp memories that take him back to the day he lost his older brother Piers.
Around the 26th of each month, it's full moon here. And that always takes me back to the night we spent on the hill after the tsunami, and in the morning when when the cockerels got going at about 4 o'clock. Whenever I hear a cockerel now, it immediately takes me back. And likewise, when I hear helicopters fly overhead here, it reminds me of the 5 days that we spent looking for Piers in Phuket. A picture of Piers has been sent to the hospital.
For days, Luke and his friends traced rumours that Piers was alive, but sadly they proved untrue. Ultimately, Luke found the answer here at a temple mortuary. Piers' passport was still in his pocket. They'd found the truth they feared. In dealing with his death, the family has set up a charity in Piers' name. They're overwhelmed by the support they've had.
It's really been quite daunting, in fact, just how many people we've touched, or our little story has touched. And I'm constantly amazed because we were just one small family.
People's little stories have had a powerful effect. Andy Tando from Kent gave up his holiday to become a volunteer stretcher bearer at a temple in Khao Lak.
Yeah, that was the mortuary there.
He worked here ferrying the dead for an extraordinary 5 weeks. Now the last containers of bodies are leaving the temple to go to the main identification centre in Phuket. In Thailand, 2,000 bodies are still to be identified. The temple, though, has been restored to itself.
Now it's beautiful, it's peace and it's lovely. I can even hear the birds singing. Before I couldn't hear the birds singing at all. And just to see people milling about doing their normal everyday things, it's nice. We've moved on.
There's only a few days before the monsoon, and there's a lot of work to be done before the rains arrive. But at least in Thailand, there's a sense of hope that with every new season, there's a chance for a new beginning, a chance to move on from the terrible memories of the tsunami. Kylie Morris, BBC News, Khao Lak.
Journalists and broadcasting staff at the BBC have voted to go on strike in protest at plans for significant job cuts. Union leaders say their members voted overwhelmingly for industrial action, which is likely to be later this month. The corporation said it was disappointed by the decision. The world's most influential film festival opened tonight in Cannes with some of the biggest names in international cinema in attendance. Events started with the screening of Lemming, the first film competing for the top prize, the Palme d'Or. Keeping an eye on things in Cannes is our arts correspondent Razia Iqbal, and we can join her now.
Hugh, yes, the Cannes Film Festival is synonymous with glamour. How could it not be here on the French Riviera? But it's also a place where the art of film is taken very seriously, as is the business of buying and selling films. Sounds and sights on the Croisette, the strip in Cannes where ordinary life is interrupted for the 11 days of the film festival. It is unmistakably French and unrelenting in its glamorous allure. And stories on the screen is why they all come.
Vous voulez que je vous dise? Vous faites pitié.
Lemming is the opening film of the competition, and every film involves a series of interviews with the stars. Charlotte Rampling, today's big screen draw, is whisked here and there to promote her film and extol the virtues of Cannes.
People outside the business and in the business, I mean, just look at them when they get one of their films selectioned at Cannes and you'll know. I mean, it's just the tops.
Even Hollywood acknowledges that. Blatant promotion is everywhere. These are films that are not even being shown here. Cannes, though, is a massive marketplace where films are bought and sold.
Let's just see that with the blue, 3 points as well.
And the marketplace is crucial for those starting out, too. British filmmaker Thomas Clay will show his first feature film in Cannes.
It's an opportunity to take the film out onto a kind of world stage. It allows the film to go out and reach other countries.
In years to come, Thomas Clay may well be walking this red carpet with a film in competition for the Palme d'Or. As cinema's elite strut their stuff, they do so knowing that they are part of a festival where glamour is just one side of it. Art matters here, but as it's Cannes, the glitz is never very far away. This is really what makes Cannes unique. If you love cinema, nowhere beats it, but it's also a place where reputations can be made or broken. And also where film deals are done, and always, everything with that certain sense of style. Hugh.
Razia, thank you very much. And if you're a digital viewer, you can see more of that interview with Charlotte Rampling on our interactive service, 10 o'clock News Extra. Right, we'll be back a little later with the latest on the headlines. Now it's time to join our news teams across the UK. Bye for now.
Good evening from BBC London News. I'm Matt Barbett. Scotland Yard says it's very concerned about the surging gun crime on London's streets. The capital has seen a fourfold increase in shootings in the past 4 weeks compared to the same period last year. As our Home Affairs correspondent Guy Smith now reports, the Met says it's worried by the nature of trivial disputes between teenagers that now involve guns.
Paul Moore from Tottenham was convicted and sentenced to 4 years in a young offenders institution. His crime, armed robbery and possession of firearms. He's been out just 18 months now and recently started working with teenagers, helping them to avoid the same mistakes and to say no to gun violence.
Put down the guns, go to school, keep your head in your school books. It's not worth it, man, because at the end of the day, it will come serious consequences.
Like what?
Prison or death.
Last month, there was a record number of shootings in London, 49. That's 4 times higher than the previous April. It's causing deep concern, although overall gun crime in the capital, which also includes reported sightings of a weapon, is falling. This April, there were 2 murders and a 3rd death. A suspected drug dealer here in Edgware was shot dead by armed police.
It gets much worse around the summertime. If we don't deal with the issues right now, we'll be dealing with something quite serious in the few months ahead.
I'm told you can buy a gun on the street for as little as £50. That's less than the price you'd pay for a pair of trainers. And because they're so accessible, children apparently as young as 14 can get hold of one. These are the sort of guns police have seized in the past. It's a constant battle keeping ahead of the gunmen, the motives ranging from gang tension to quite trivial matters.
We are worried by the increase. Therefore, people will be seeing more anti-gun crime operations. They will be seeing more arrests, they will be seeing even more seizures.
And for Paul Moore, his message too is clear. He prefers freedom to losing it. Guy Smith, BBC London News.
Officers hunting the gang who killed a 16-year-old girl in Reading and seriously wounded her 18-year-old friend have made 2 more arrests. One man was detained in London, the other in Birmingham. Mary-Ann Lenihan was found stabbed in a park on Saturday. Now, Metropolitan Police officers are to visit the Bahamas to investigate the death of a toddler. The highly unusual move comes after a request from the Foreign Office. 2-year-old Paul Gallagher was killed by a speedboat on a beach in the Bahamas in 2002. Last year, a South London coroner recorded an open verdict into his death but urged further investigation by the Bahamian authorities. Now, millions of tons of freight could soon be taken off the roads and transported around the capital on its network of canals. It's an attempt to bring about a renaissance for London's waterways and take them back to their original use. Our transport correspondent, Andrew Winstanley, now reports.
The HGVs thundered past on the A40, London's supply line. But just beneath the road, there was an alternative.
I'm ready to go. 70 tonnes of your finest.
The call meant freshly quarried sand was now being loaded onto a conveyor, heading for a greener form of transport. This contract, supplying a concrete works in West Drayton, is the first in 30 years on the canals, but it won't be the last. Here in Kensal Green, the first part of a £1.6 million project is underway. The idea is to clean up the canal bed for freight barges. A prime target for business will be waste haulage. The ambition to carry 2 million tonnes worth in a decade's time. In the canal's heyday, the waterways were themselves congested, supplying the Industrial Revolution and beyond. But now, with the roads congested, the water's again looking attractive. Transport for London's involved. They'll try to broker some deals.
The Mayor's transport policies, environmental policies are designed to make us think about new ways of dealing with old problems.
The money committed will pay for a new wharf at Willesden Junction that may serve a new recycling plant. There will be further widening in stretches and increased dredging. But for a major renaissance, a lot more money's needed. Exactly how much is now being assessed in a major new report.
on this particular barge, there's 5 truckloads of sand, so it's like 5 8-wheeler lorries that we're taking off the road.
Great Britain's gold medal winning coxless 4 from the Sydney Olympics got back in a boat together today for the first time in 5 years. Sir Steve Redgrave, Sir Matthew Pinsent, Tim Foster and James Cracknell will compete in a Legends sprint race over 500 metres at the end of the month. The race will be one of the highlights of the World Cup regatta being held at Dorney Lake in Eton.
It'll be great to be in part of an international regatta with all the top crews that are aiming for Beijing. But with our little fun race of trying to raise some money for the tsunami appeal with the World Food Programme, I think that it would be a lot of fun. I think something that we would never have dreamed of about getting back into a boat, certainly not this stage of our non-careers. But no, I'm really looking forward to it.
Football now, and in the Barclays Premiership tonight, a meaningless match maybe, but you're not going to believe the scoreline. Arsenal absolutely demolished Everton 7-0. The goals came from